deep joy for me to be with you tonight. Thank you so much to Michelle, to the WCSA for welcoming me here and asking me to do this. I want to lay out for you where I'm going. I'm that type of thinker, and I'd like to know kind of where the talk's progressing. So I'm going to tell you the story about Proverbs 31 tonight, really through the lens of my own personal journey. And so what you're going to hear is how Proverbs 31 shaped my thinking personally as a college student and then later in life. You're going to hear then about Proverbs 31 in the past, the way that I look at 3 historical sites to understand more deeper context to how we see certain types of womanhood over time. And the third section will deal with the Proverbs 31 woman within the context of the book of Proverbs. And then finally, we'll get around to some application. So that's kind of where I'm going tonight. And then about terminology. So I'm going to throw out Proverbs 31 woman. It's so long and clunky. So I'm thinking P31 woman. I tried to rename her, came up with nothing. So basically, that's where I will be shifting in between tonight. So you can keep up with me. They all mean the same thing, what I'm talking about. But let me start first by actually reading this passage that I'm going to be spending a lot of time tonight talking about. And if you have your Bibles, of course, open up and join me. I'm reading from the ESV version. An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers the field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all of her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchants. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. My first memory about hearing about this P31 woman was in college, and it comes through kind of a funny story. There was a group in my InterVarsity Fellowship chapter who called themselves, a group of men who called themselves the Flesh Beaters. This was based on 1 Corinthians 9:27. I beat my flesh, right, or I strike a blow to my body to make it a slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. So part of this flesh beater group involved confessing sins to one another and then beating each other with pool noodles. You seriously cannot make this stuff up. It just happens. So one day, I was chatting with one of them after a large group meeting, and he was talking about this new woman he had just started dating, and he was raving about her, and he explained to me that she was the total Proverbs 31 woman. And from his enthusiasm and his facial expression, I knew that that metaphor signified a whole range of fabulousness, which I just did not understand yet. So I was wondering, as I was researching for this talk, if the P31 woman still had the same type of resonance. And I found that, in fact, it does. There's one group of men at Baylor University who recently started what they called a student movement. It has over 10,000 likes on Facebook at this point, I believe. Based around this, I'd rather have a Proverbs 31 woman than a Victoria's Secret model. And this is the entire campaign that they developed at Baylor, which has all kinds of different connotations, but certainly what it's trying to do in one sense is to turn on end cultural notions of female hotness, right? How we determine who's hot and who isn't. And based on the spring sing joke a few nights ago, I know that it also resonates with the Westmont community. So for those of you who weren't there, let me let you in on the joke. The Clark men's dorm, I believe, was doing a skit where Dr. Kielstrom was talking to somebody who was dressed as President Beebe and referred to President Beebe's wife as "she's so hot, a total babe." At which point, the student playing President Beebe looks at Dr. Kielstrom angrily, and so he covers up really quickly and says, "I mean, she's a total Proverbs 31 woman." So clearly, these are still resonant messages. The Proverbs 31 woman holds this place in our mind. So I pretty much figured out in college that calling someone a P31 woman was a biblical way to call a Christian woman hot. That must be it, right? And I'd be lying if I didn't immediately think at that point, I want to be considered a Proverbs 31 woman. I don't know what that means yet, but I know that I want to be considered one. It's clearly something good, and I want to be in that sort of spectrum of Christian hot, whatever that looks like. So who did Christian culture think the Proverbs 31 woman was? How did this flesh beater from my college fellowship envision his total Proverbs 31 woman? And I did some research at that point, and here's some just some visuals for you that kind of illustrate these points. But I decided to look at the basic mainstream of evangelical culture and what sort of mainstream evangelical culture was saying, this is what the Proverbs 31 woman is. And I isolated 3 different characteristics. The first one was a homemaker. And some of the text I'm drawing from is from 2 very prominent authors on this subject, John Piper and Wayne Grudem, and I'm using them not to single them out as much as to say they've written extensively on this, and I think it's really worthwhile to talk about what they've said since they've written about it directly. And in their Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, they write, a woman's primary responsibility is to care for children and the home, as Proverbs 31 indicates. And we must realize that the emphasis on the home is the very point of the Proverbs passage. The woman in Proverbs works to care for her family and to fulfill her responsibility to her family. The second quality that I noticed comes up a lot in conversation about a Proverbs 31 woman is that she is budget savvy. One woman wrote, a virtuous woman seeks her husband's approval before making purchases and spends money wisely. So she is careful to purchase quality items which her family needs. Same author. And many articles that I read see the Proverbs 31 woman's model as one of bargain hunting, smart shopping, making sure that you shop with a list, don't buy hungry, kinds of common sense sorts of mandates. And then the third aspect that I noticed when I was pulling this information of trying to figure out what a Proverbs 31 woman was that she was obedient. Piper and Grudem argue, the woman in Proverbs has not sought to find herself or to make her own career, but rather to serve her family. Her decisions in this realm must not be unilateral, but made under the leadership of the husband as the head of the marriage and the family. At the end of this, I thought, okay, a homemaker who is obedient and budget savvy. That equaled Christian hot. Like that was what Christian hot was being projected as to me. And I thought, you know, I really want to get here. I really want to be this person. So I tried to read Proverbs 31, keeping these things in mind, and I was really open to them being exactly what I should have been. And I should make a point at this to let you know that at that stage in my journey, I deeply believed in the validity of Scripture and how that had to inform my understanding of the way I saw myself. I still deeply believe in the validity of Scripture. At that particular moment in time, though, I thought that that meant I had to have certain thoughts about biblical womanhood. And I would have put myself on the complementarian end of the spectrum. So I approached my study of this with that in mind, and I want you to understand that. It is only with humility that I approach this subject, or that I am even talking about this. And I can provide pretty good justifications on both sides. But again, this is a personal journey, right? As much of our wrestling through Scripture can be. So parts of Proverbs 31 right off the bat started to bother me. And I realized that there were because of my own place that I came from. So the first part was that as I was reading through Proverbs 31, I thought, this woman is completely foreign to my life. She's clearly some type of wealthy aristocrat who has servants, who has the money to buy real estate, who negotiates in merchandise and trade. There's an entire realm of her business affairs that she has control over, or has some kind of responsibility for. And then she's also handling domestic affairs and charity. And as a 20-year-old college student who came from a working class family with no future prospects to have servants that I was aware of on the horizon, and then I was faced with the fact that I pretty much hated cooking and sewing. I didn't know if I wanted to have kids. These were all things that I thought about when I'm reading this. So I thought, how could she apply to my life? I didn't understand that part of it. And then I was also struck by the fact that she seemed kind of familiar in a way that I hadn't expected her to seem. She kind of seemed like this amazing juggler, like the woman that I had grown up with in the 1970s and 80s, the woman who could do it all, who could keep the balls going of home and family and life and all these things and just do it brilliantly, right? And so she seemed familiar, and in fact, she seemed a lot like my mother. And that was when it started to hit me that there was something else going on here. Because as I'm going through the passage, I think, okay, well, rising while it's yet night and providing food for her household. Well, when I was 7 or 8, my mom, she was probably up at 3 in the morning to accomplish this. I needed to take something in for Valentine's Day to my elementary school. And I woke up, it was like 6:30 in the morning, and I walk out, and there, spread out over the range, are, I don't know, probably 30 heart-shaped cookies with pink frosting, all iced and with red icing with the names of every single student in my class. And I was like, Mom, you're just, wow, I can't believe you did that for me. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Every single year, all 4 of us had homemade Halloween costumes. I am not joking. And because there's 4 people, that means you can do a lot of themes. So we were Wizard of Oz one year. The next year, we were Mickey and Minnie and Donald and Daisy. It was a brush. At one point, I think she did some other type of animal configuration. It was all really creative and imaginative. And every single year for Christmas, we got quilts. My mother was an incredibly prolific quilter, and she would do all kinds of quilting. And yes, that equals a lot of quilts. By the time you're done, you have a ton of quilts. What are you going to do with all those quilts? But yeah, there was a lot of quilting. So yes. And indeed, her children arose and called her blessed. We were delighted by some of these things she did for us. Absolutely delighted. She was amazing. And so on the surface, this all seems very ideal and very Proverbs 31. And yet, because I was close to the story, there's a lot more going on there than could be held up kind of on that surface. See, my mom is actually a really talented opera singer. When she was 24 years old without any training at all, she auditioned for the San Francisco Opera, which still to this day is considered the top second opera in the country after the Met. And she got in her first time with almost no training. She was incredible. She shot right to the top near the beginning. She had me when she was 27 and was right away asked to be part of this international touring company and part of a master's program that would have promoted her to being a pretty big star. And this picture, anybody know who this picture is of? Anyone? How are my opera skills out there, people? Come on. Yes, it is. Good job. This is Luciano Pavarotti. And this is me, and I look, unfortunately, very much like a Muppet in this picture. But my mother is pregnant with my brother at this time, and this is kind of a fun story, just to tell you. He had come backstage. She would know the production. I can't remember. But he had come backstage, and as you can see, there's a little bit of what looks like blood on his face from whatever scene that he was in. And as a little 2-year-old, it really frightened me. I was scared. And I started crying when I saw him. And, oh, no, my darling. I'm doing a terrible Italian. But anyway, basically, he came over and he wipes the blood from his forehead and puts it on my lips, and it was toothpaste. And he did it as sort of a peacemaking gesture. And he carried me around for much of the rest of that evening. But as this picture might suggest, my mom is backstage of the Opera House with me because she didn't have childcare that day, right? And she needed to bring me with her. And so she made it work. And so at one point when she's pregnant, right around this time, right when she was about ready to think about touring, she was faced with the fact that, what do I do? Do I do this international opera career, or should I stay home and be a mother? And she chose mothering. She chose to stay home and to be a mother. The problem with that vision for our family was that it wasn't economically feasible. My dad was a non-college educated pipe fitter and sometime factory worker and was often laid off in lots of cycles. And so what happened was they had 4 kids. There was never very much money. And what it left us with was the fact that my mom, when she had pictured mothering, what it was to look like, maybe some of the ways that we picture the way our mothers raised us, or even read this passage, we see it in this light of staying home full time. My mom wanted to homeschool. At one point, she threw out wanting to raise pigs. I don't know how legitimate that was. That might have just been her being funny. But those were all things she brought up. But instead, what happened was, for our family to survive, she was pushed into a lot of part-time and full-time work that she didn't really want to do. And we moved a lot, so my dad could take advantage of employment opportunities. And I think from the time I was born until high school, I moved about 11 times, if that gives you a sense of how my family was really struggling to survive in a lot of ways. And so when a woman is pulled in that many ways, as my mom was, never being able to sort of settle into anything, I think it's rare for her to laugh at the time to come. And I would say that I doubt that's very much what my mother was doing when she was standing in line for food stamps with the 3 of us because my dad had lost his job again, and she didn't know what to do. And as often the case when we read Scripture, who we are and where we've been influence how we read it. And so I was left with this model for Christian womanhood that felt nearly logistically impossible for me, given my station in life. And I felt all kinds of impossibility for my mom and for her situation in which she'd been through. And so I just couldn't shake the sensation that every time that I read Proverbs 31, I felt kind of nervous and inadequate. And I also thought that I was probably really going to have to explain to God one day why I had whited out that entire section of Proverbs. I'm joking. Anyway, but this sense of nervousness, this sense of inadequacy is not something that I'm alone on. When I was doing research for this talk, I discovered 2 websites, I'm not kidding you, with the names Why I Hate the Proverbs 31 Woman and The Proverbs 31 Woman Disturbs Me! ! Those are the names of the websites. And so what I decided at that point was, I may not be able to bake, I may not be able to sew, I don't know very much about gathering wool and flax, but I'm really good in school, and I'm really, really good at reading, and I like history a lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to understand what's the possibility of the Proverbs 31 woman in a different point in time. I'm going to go back through history, and I'm going to map it out, and I'm going to chart it, and I'm going to see if it's possible. How likely is it that a woman, that the majority of women maybe, could be Proverbs 31 women, and look past my own blinders in this contemporary moment. And so I picked 3 historical eras that have significance for American Christians. I picked the Roman Empire, I picked Puritans, mostly in New England, not so much in England, and then Victorians. And in each era, I'm asking, what does the role of the woman look like in this era? What does the role of the household look like? And how likely is it, how practical is it for women to be able to achieve this P31 ideal? What does that look like? I really need a disclaimer here. The past is really complicated and really nuanced, and I've just picked 3 completely disjointed periods of time without a lot of connectivity between them. And even talking about the Roman Empire is just a laugh because, I could pick any one point among hundreds of years and give you some differences. So, and for the purposes of time in this talk, and also the purposes of drawing some themes, I'm going to make some generalizations. Please ask me about them. Clearly, I don't believe that everything is so incredibly homogeneous. So let's start with the Roman Empire. I'm going to lead you with me on this journey that I took. So ancient Rome in general was a man's world. Aristotle famously wrote, "The man has rule of the household by nature, for the deliberative faculty in a woman is inferior. In children it does not yet exist, and in the case of slaves it is completely absent." Politics, society, and the family men held both power and the purse strings. And at the head of Roman family life and the head of a Roman household, it was always the oldest living male. It's called the paterfamilias, right? The father of the family. And this paterfamilias had absolute rule over his household and children, which included extended family, and in wealthy households also would have included servants and slaves. This is the person who looked over all of the family's business affairs, all of the family's property. And certainly, while men had all of the formal power in a lot of cases, women did exert some influence in this. It was accepted, particularly in elite families, that the materfamilias was in charge, or the mother of the families was in charge of managing the household. She has no legal authority to do this, but it's just sort of the de facto order. It's the de facto arrangement. And in the upper classes, women would often be expected to come alongside their husbands to help advance their careers. So being certain objects of modesty or grace or dignity. And for some women, and this is a very limited number, but it's worth mentioning, there are some women that are doing businesses. There are some women that are doing real estate development. And there are some women who are being educated and are working as scribes. A small number, but they do exist. At points during the empire, and this is also something that you should know, the paterfamilias, when you got married, you would typically, at the earlier stage of the empire, you would be handed over by your father to your husband. And in that process, that's where the legal authority would transfer. But at later points in the Roman Empire, that was not the case. In fact, the father would retain control and would retain the sort of power and authority over the woman, even though she got married. So it's very different than the way that we might think about the marriage relationship. But for the average Roman woman, owning or working in any kind of business endeavor seems to have been really exceptional. But ordinary women did work outside of the home sometimes, and typically their occupations would have been wet nurses, would have been midwives, and then for a small assortment, there would have been in sort of the range of actresses, performers, and then prostitutes. So these are kinds of the working places we would have expected to see. We would have expected to see average women. As you can imagine, there is a stigma to occupations, sometimes like acting and prostitution. But for wet nurses, that would have been considered a pretty good occupation and one that was favorably looked upon. Okay, so what does all of this mean for our P31 woman? Well, I laid this all out and I thought, okay, so according to P31 standards, only a very elite group of noble women would have had the informal authority or privileged status to consider a field and buy it, to sell merchandise, and have husbands who are among the elders of the land. So it was a very narrow group of women. Some women, those who worked as wet nurses, and midwives especially, would have had to put the needs of their clients and their clients' children, really, above the needs of their own families in order to survive. These are women who might be bringing food into their families through wage labor or barter labor, however that looked in their particular community. And they would have relied on a network of women relatives to help them care for their households and their families. It would have looked a little bit different. What's interesting is that almost every woman, the one universally kind of true thing about the Roman Empire, which is fascinating, is that women from ordinary to noble women all valued the work of weaving and spinning. And so even noble women were found doing it and glorifying in there doing it. Look at me, what a great spinner or weaver I am. And ordinary women would have done it. And so that is one uniting part that they all would have sort of been able to understand about Proverbs 31. Okay, so that is our Roman Empire family. Moving along to Puritan New England. And this is a really different place. This is a really different time. Fast forward, 1,500 years. Really, really different place that wasn't even thought of in the Roman Empire in North America. And of course, this is during the colonial era, so it's before the United States as a country. And this was governed by the household family economy. In Puritan New England, the home was the site of work for the entire family. And when I say the entire family, I mean it. In order to make the family survive, we're not just talking about men and women working, we're talking about children working, because that's what happened. And whether it was some type of artisanal trade or it was farming, that is the type of work that would have happened in the home. So men, in that sense, were in charge of both the home and the workplace at the same time. It was truly patriarchal in that way. There's no division in this culture between home and work. It just doesn't exist in that frame, okay? And so there are some gender divisions in labor that we see in this household family economy, but the way it just varies seasonally, because as we know, what happens is that there's harvest time and you're on a farm and everybody harvests, right? And so it doesn't really matter if we say that women aren't supposed to work in the fields, they end up working in the fields. As you can see from this picture here, that top, the one on your top left, is a family in the household economy who's doing the weaving. It's the father. The father's doing the weaving in this. And it means that they probably had some type of production deadline that needed to get done. And this is just what happens when you have a household economy. Everybody works. Everybody gets it done. And women would also, if their husbands were out of town, if they were away doing business work, they would serve sometimes as deputy husbands and take over the runnings of the business. In Puritan New England, women are considered inferior to men in all respects. Women are under the law of coverture at this time, which means that wives are subsumed under the name and the legal identity of their husbands. The only women in Puritan New England who could have owned property or entered contracts were widows, were women whose husbands had died and left them as the independent person. And women are, very interestingly at this time, considered morally inferior. And I want you to capture this a little bit, because I think we sometimes flatten the past, and I think this happens with Puritans a lot. But what we see is that in colonial rape cases that came up, women were always the ones who were morally suspect. They were the ones who were guilty for luring and despoiling the men's higher character. And that what we see from this is that really men are the guards of morality. They are the ones who are given the full authority over children, over discipline, and over education of children. Women aren't considered as morally privileged to be able to offer that to their children. So that aside, what you should know is noteworthy about Puritan society, though, for the time, is that it's the Puritan faith, it's the religion itself that offers women just a little bit more protection than they would have had in England, they would have had in the Chesapeake, they would have had in other parts of this New World. And it's because women are considered spiritually equal before God. And the Puritans do believe that women have individual relationships with God, with salvation, that is absolutely direct access given equally to men and women. And also, the Puritans, they kind of I love the Puritans, they just throw you for a loop. Right when you think you understand them, they completely confuse you. So there's this real importance of love and mutuality in marriage in the Puritan faith and tradition. And so if a husband was unfaithful or abused his wife, more so than many other cultures, Puritan women could easily obtain a divorce because that man would have been seen to completely go back on his covenant with his wife. And so it's kind of this interesting philosophy where it's that women are inferior, but in terms of things like marriage, they're not seen sort of in that same way. Okay, so what does this mean for the P31 woman? Well, unless widowed, there's no Puritan woman that would have been able to legally consider a field and buy it, according to verse 16. She also would not have been seen as having any authority over the children or her household. Any authority like that would have been given to the male patriarch. The second thing, most women would have had some experience with a gendered division of labor in the household economy, because in general, in those situations, she probably would have done more food preparation and more textile work. But still, in the household economy, as I mentioned, everyone works to get the job done, which means that men would weave and women would farm. And so the division of labor was much blurrier. And it's interesting, in my research for this, I came across a Puritan commentator on Proverbs 31, Matthew Henry, from the late the late 1600s. And he actually interprets, I think it's verse 13, she seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. And he writes, she applies herself to the business that is proper for her. It is not in a scholar's business or statesman's business or husbandman's business that she employs herself, but in women's business. She seeks wool and flax. And it's interesting because of what we know to be true about Puritan households, but also when we see literature like this that could be prescriptive, right? That says, this is what the ideal would be in terms of separate types of gender divisions, but this is the way it doesn't really work often in the family economy because we all have to get the work done. And so sometimes how our notions of prescription aren't always the same as what happens on the ground. And because of the emphasis on love-based marriages, which would have been different than Roman counterparts who are looking to cement real family and economic connections, I would say that Puritan men would have been much more likely to agree with verse 11, which is the heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. And in fact, in my research, I discovered that one of the key passages for a Puritan woman's funeral was Proverbs 31, and it was a way for a husband to praise her and to eulogize her. And I thought that was really interesting. Okay, last historical group here, and we have the Victorians. What we have that changes in these 200 years between the Puritans and the mid-19th century when we start to see the rise of what I'm calling the Victorians, which is really part of English tradition, and that's where it comes from, but it's adopted in the US as well. We see with the Industrial Revolution a huge change in the way that work happens. Transportation networks spread out, and all kinds of factories develop. So where the home used to be the site of production, pretty much exclusively, that's all changed. And production gets removed from the middle-class home. And that means that the division of labor changes. And so there's this very, very important shift in gender roles that's often referred to as separate spheres ideology. And what it is it's a way to help make all of these economic changes a little bit less frightening. And what it does is it develops two distinct realms. On one hand, we have the public world, which men are supposed to be part of. And on the other hand, we have the private world, which women are supposed to be part of. So what is really important to know about this is that the home, part of the private world, becomes absolutely a glorified site of solace that's away from the harsh public world. It becomes a place to sort of hunker down from the political and economic changes that are happening. And also, one of the crucial parts of separate spheres ideology that forms, even today, some of our understanding about gender difference is the notion that there are natural or innate qualities that apply to certain people of certain genders. And so what we learn about the nature of men, or what separate spheres tells us, is that, well, men are more comfortable in the public world. They're more comfortable because they're competitive. Men are more ambitious and driven. Men are more rational. They're more analytical. They can work through the realm of ideas more. They don't tend to make decisions based on emotion, but on intellect. But also, and this is a key difference, men are corruptible. Men are not as morally safe as women. Men are often led astray because of their exposure and access to this new, scary, public industrial world. And on the other hand, we have women who are part of this private sphere. And part of the new ideas about the nature of women are that they're cooperative. They're self-sacrificing and they want to get along and to make things work. They're sentimental. They're emotional. They make decisions because of that emotion and that sentiment. And they are pious. Women are morally superior to men. And we see this a little bit. I've given you a little bit of Victorian handiwork here that signifies this type of sentimentality and this type of piety, this idea that is our home a heaven? And working through that concept of home, what home looks like, all kinds of little slogans and sayings. And it distills together kind of the world of the home, a place that was separate and private. And Separate Spheres does several things for women in the US and some in Britain. On one hand, and this may surprise you, it really elevates women's status. And it does that because now women have a calling that's separate and different from men. It says, women, you have these attributes and virtues that are worth celebrating. You're more pious, You are more cooperative. These are things about you. And so because of those innate features of you, you now have control over the household. You now have autonomy over this dominion, which was previously, remember, in all of the other places we've looked at, men were the ones that really had control over the household. And it gave women incredible amounts of expanded educational opportunities. Since they were supposed to be the bearers of virtue to their children and educating their children, it gave them great opportunity to learn so that they could instruct their children. So we see these definite expansions in some ways of women's status. But at the same time, what we see is that it's increasingly difficult for women to work outside of the home, especially if they're married, because women are seen as being corrupted the minute they enter that public sphere. And so there's a great amount of work to move women out of that public sphere. And so what this does in kind of an odd way is it ends up devaluing women's work. And you have to follow me on this one. But when we have a household economy and everybody's working together and everything we do together creates how our family survives, there is no such thing as a male breadwinner. It doesn't exist. Because we all win together, right? This is the whole point of a household family economy. But the second that we say, no, men, you're over here, women, you're over here, that is when we have two different kinds of work. We have wage labor and we have unwaged labor. So we have the work of business, the marketplace, politics over here where you command a wage, and we have the work of childcare and laundry and cooking over here for which no wage is given. And suddenly that split in wages makes a difference in the devaluation of women's work. And coverture is still the prevailing attitude, legal status at this time, meaning women are covered by their husbands. Okay, so what does this mean for Proverbs 31 women? Well, it's significant because homekeeping now takes on a moral and ideological significance that it did not have before. The roles described in Proverbs 31 of making clothing and securing food for the family, managing servants and charity work, all of those things are now roles considered given primarily to women. And that where women could have exercised a large degree of autonomy in the Victorian household. Anything related to the marketplace, though, anything, so buying land, farming, trading, selling, would have been seen as a transgression of a woman's rightful place, which is the home. And so since the home was no longer that site of production, it meant the entire business world was left to men. So the only way that a woman had access to the public sphere was through charity work and reform work. And maybe some of you have picked up on this already, but the third thing is, who do you think separate spheres ideology covered? I have a couple of my history students in here who should have known this. It covers the middle class and the upper class, right? Who it does not cover? It doesn't cover the working class. It doesn't cover the immigrant women. It doesn't cover rural women who are still farming, and it doesn't cover slave women. In fact, it doesn't cover most women. But it has a tremendous amount of ideological importance in thinking about women and how women should be, even if it's not on the ground worked out that way. So at the end of all of this historical study, and I'm so glad you walked with me through this very long process, I extracted two key themes. The first is that achieving all parts of the Proverbs 31 woman has always been culturally, socially, or legally limited. But that really changes depending upon the time and context. Said another way, at no one point in time could everything be possible for most women in the eras and places that I surveyed. Something always had to give. It was very rare and almost non-existent that the majority of women could have actually physically, legally, socially been the Proverbs 31 woman. And the second was the Proverbs 31 woman often reinforced rather than challenge the existing socioeconomic order. She could be whomever our culture validated that women should be at that given historical moment. She had kind of a shape-shifting quality to her. And that meant that some women were affirmed because of their social status or access, while other women were denied because of their social status and access. So after all of this historical exploration, I really needed a break. I'm not joking. I was tired, and so I put the P31 woman on the back of my intellectual bookshelf for probably next to a decade before I picked her up again. And so it wasn't until this point where I was asked to lead a women's Bible study. It was going to be on Proverbs. And I thought, oh, that's great. I don't think I've ever studied the whole of Proverbs before. This will be so fun as one big unit. I've studied it in all these little chunk sections because it's an oracle book and it's easy to do that. But I wanted to really study it sort of in its whole. And so I was excited. I was excited to do this study. And it really was a fun study with a great group of women. And I was learning all kinds of fantastic things about the difference between wisdom and foolishness, about how the tongue played into all kinds of devastation, and also what the fear of the Lord really meant. And we spent a lot of time thinking through what that looked like. In all of that fun, I completely lost track of what was coming next. And I will never forget the rush of emotions when I sat down on that Wednesday night to prepare my Bible study for the next week for my group and realized that I was going to have to deal with the P31 woman. And so in all of my P31 fabulousness, I girded my loins, right, for the task ahead and employed my best inductive Bible study skills that I could. And I really was determined, I'm going to have a positive attitude about this. Lord, I'm going to learn something from you. I am excited to learn. Even though I was thinking I have all this baggage about this, but I'm not going to think about that. I'm just going to trudge forward. So, as I was studying this, there were some things that struck me the first time that I noticed this time too. The first was, this was definitely an aristocrat. I mean, I couldn't believe that I even kind of equivocated about that before. I mean, look at her servants, look at her real estate, look at her merchandising. But you know what? I noticed it more this time than I'd noticed it before because I'd spent a lot of time living with poor people. And I realized that I had spent a lot of time living with poor people who were pretty godly. And I was thinking, this is really interesting. The poor woman I just lived next door to would never have been able to do this. But dang it, did she love Jesus. So I was really on my mind when I was reading this. I also noticed this time something that I'd never noticed before. I noticed what the passage didn't say. For speaking as the ideal of Christian womanhood, the passage said nothing about P31's personal relationship with her husband. It said nothing about her intellectual or emotional strengths. And it said nothing about her religious activities. And I remembered thinking, that's really weird that I never noticed that before. And then my Bible, my nicely, just very briefly footnoted Bible, told me and reminded me that this was an acrostic in Hebrew, right? That it starts with every single letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And that's a common technique in oral tradition so that you can remember it, right? So it was something that was recited and it was something that was known. But this time, as I'm going through, something's nagging me. Something was bothering me, and it was this sense of familiarity. But I couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't figure out what it was. What's bothering me? There's something here, but I'm not seeing it. And so I thought, okay, checklist of inductive Bible study. Okay, repetition. Do I see repetition here? Yeah, it talks about wisdom. That's all over Proverbs. It talks about the fear of the Lord. That's all over Proverbs. That wasn't really it. That wasn't satisfying me. I still felt like there was something else. So then I thought, okay, audience. There must be something here about the audience that's striking me or that I've seen. And I thought, well, no, I mean, it sets it up as the oracle that the Queen Mother gave to Solomon, basically. And that doesn't hit me either. And then I thought, okay, what's next on my list? Repetition, audience, subject. I could not tell you that sensation of the light being turned on in my head in a way I had never read this before. That sense of understanding when you get something and you've never gotten it and you just got it and you just think, dang it, that's awesome. That's amazing. I know many of you have been there before. It's one of the reasons that I got a PhD. You kind of have to have this feeling if you're going to do this all the time. But it was really exciting. It was really amazing because I'm sitting there reading through this with fresh eyes. The thing is, I'd seen this subject before in Proverbs. And that was what struck me, that had never struck me before. And that's why it felt familiar. And so what I just did automatically was I just started flipping. And I flipped to Proverbs 8. Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, she cries aloud. Proverbs 9, wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She also has set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in the town. Could it be that Proverbs 31 woman was the personification of wisdom? You see, there were connections all over the place. And I'd never seen it before because I'd never studied Proverbs as one book. But then as I started going through it, I thought, yeah, wisdom is prosperous. It's confident, even in the face of uncertain future. It's a public figure in the marketplace and at city gates, industrious and strong, and wisdom is female in the book of Proverbs. So let me just stop here to say, as any good inductive Bible study student does, the second that they get some type of revelation like this and they've never heard it before, you run to a commentary as fast as you can, because otherwise you open yourself up for certain heresy, is what I was always taught. Like, if no, Bible study should be done in community. We need to find community understanding, right? I don't want to have a separate interpretation of this. I want my interpretation to be an interpretation among community for it to be accurate. So I open my commentary. My eyes land on the following sentence. The woman of Proverbs 31 is a symbol of all that wisdom represents, who some scholars have called Lady Wisdom. As the commentator went on to explain, this poem played an important part in the personification of wisdom that was so common in ancient Near East cultures. But rather than deify wisdom, as all the other ancient Near East cultures had done, Proverbs simply describes wisdom as a woman. It doesn't deify wisdom. And the authors pointed out several features I would never have noticed in my inductive Bible study. First, this passage is similar to hymns, but this one extols wisdom. And it's really fun to put Psalm 111 next to Proverbs 31, and you can kind of see the similarities between the two. Second, this passage has similarities with heroic literature. The vocabulary in Hebrew and the expressions, they often sound more like an ode to a battle champion, a military warrior, than to a domestic scene. And in fact, many of the words in Hebrew are used to talk throughout the Old Testament about battle. And so when you put these features together, as the commentators explained to me, one would conclude that P31 is a hymn to Lady Wisdom, written in the heroic mode. Using this arrangement allows the sage to make all the lessons of wisdom in the book concrete and practical. It provides a polemic against the culture that saw women as merely decorative, and it depicts the greater heroism as moral and domestic, rather than only exploits on the battlefield. All this time I had missed it. I had been looking for a socioeconomic household to duplicate, and this was talking about the household of wisdom that Lady Wisdom offers us in Proverbs 9:4-6, when she says, "Whoever is simple, let him turn in here to my house. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live and walk in the way of insight." To say that that time of Bible study rocked my world would be a grave, grave, grave understatement. It was incredible, because what happened in that moment was, on one hand, I suddenly had tremendous freedom. And on the other hand, I felt deeply convicted and ashamed. I had missed the passage's entire point and left myself off the spiritual hook. So let me tell you, I'm going to tell you a story that shows you how I let myself off the spiritual hook. And a ruler asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother." And the ruler said, "All these I have kept from my youth." When Jesus heard this, he said to him, "One thing you still lack. Sell all that you have and distribute it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." But when the ruler heard these things, he became very sad, for he was extremely rich. Jesus says to the rich young ruler, I don't want your checklist. I want your heart. Jesus says to us, I don't want your checklist. I want your heart. Part of the reason that Proverbs 31 has lived on as this grand model of all things good for Christian women is because she can be distilled into a checklist. If I just accomplish these 15 things, I'll get it. I'll be godly. If I just confine my responsibilities to those listed in this passage, I have a doable legacy. The thing about Jesus is, and whenever we view Scripture through the light of Jesus, is that he asks far more from us than a checklist, if it were only so easy. And like Jesus, Lady Wisdom says, look, it's not that I want you to just believe that Jesus is Lord. I want you to reorganize your entire household so that it rests on kingdom values. After all, wisdom is only wisdom when it's acted upon. So who does Lady Wisdom ask that we be wise like? Well, maybe like Rahab, whose job as a prostitute may not have made her a paragon of female virtue at any point in history that we've looked at today, but who made a radical and brave decision to harbor fugitives because of faith, and who God then rewarded by putting in the lineage of Jesus. Lady Wisdom asks us to be wise like Esther, whose beauty and charm were in fact the reason that she gained access to the king through her role as a concubine and then queen to save her people from genocide. And I should mention too, and whose bravery would not have been possible without the previous sacrifice of Queen Vashti, who would not come when she was called and knew it was death, because she didn't want to be paraded around like an object in front of all of her king's friends. Esther, Rahab, Hannah, Ruth, Sarah, Miriam, and company all fall short of the righteousness of Christ, but their righteousness by faith is nonetheless praised. The thing is, none of them perfectly conforms to the Proverbs 31 woman, not one, but that's because the Proverbs 31 woman isn't the woman they're supposed to be following. The person we're supposed to be following, all of us, is Christ Jesus our Lord. In the end, the P31 woman serves as a model for all disciples of Jesus, male, female, all of us. We serve a God who's dissatisfied by our pharisaical desire to make checklists, and says instead he wants and deserves every last piece of our heart.